Good morning and welcome back to MSP TV. It's the final day of the meeting of states parties on the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and as we promised yesterday, we caught up with the president of the conference, Ambassador Alexander McMahon. Let's have a look. So we are joined now outside the conference room. Thank you so much for taking the time. This is Alexander McMahon, president of the meeting of states parties. Congratulations to your election as chair of this conference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us and squeezing this in your very busy schedule. So along with the congrats, I want to ask you about the role of Austria in the adoption of this treaty that also led to you being the chair of the first meeting.
Well, of course, now I'm the chair of the meeting, so I shouldn't really be speaking about Austria. But of course, after the humanitarian conference in 2014, we issued the Austrian pledge, which later became the humanitarian pledge, which paved the way for the negotiations. And together with a group of countries, the core group countries, I think we were instrumental in getting the negotiations to a successful conclusion.
And what are your expectations now for the MSP?
They're high, I would say, of course. I think I'm extremely encouraged by the really substantive contributions that states are making, so that is great. I think with the humanitarian and risk focus, we've given a lot more things, a lot more states arguments to speak about nuclear weapons. So the expectations is that we very clearly demonstrate that this is a serious treaty that is based on extremely profound arguments, that we will refocus on the humanitarian consequences and risks. I think we've demonstrated also the openness of the TPNW, and that we will, through this seriousness, that some of the antagonism against the treaty will fall away.
And of course, nuclear weapons have been back in the headlines lately with threats issued by Russia and the general security situation deteriorating. So it's also a very timely conference to be talking about these issues.
It's extremely timely to talk about these issues. I think it's of course very disconcerting that nuclear weapons are so high back on the agenda. Lots of people are really worried about what's going to happen, but unfortunately that's the case. And I think it very clearly underscores what we see, the fragility and the precariousness of a nuclear deterrence-based security architecture. And I think it very clearly makes the case that we need to change the paradigm and focus on the humanitarian consequences and risks. Of course, is the best way of trying to have a different conversation and move away from this nuclear theory paradigm.
And one last question before we let you go. Over the weekend, ICAN organized the Nuclear Ban Forum. You, on Monday, as the Austrian government, also organized the Humanitarian Impact Conference. There's a lot of conferences around this that come together as Nuclear Ban Week. Are we managing, as we try to bring together all of these communities, to convey that enthusiasm and that spirit also to the negotiations in the MSP?
I'm so in the middle of it that it's very hard for me to say. But my feeling is yes, because I also see really interesting and intensive media interest. I think that's very good. And it's of course because of the backdrop against which this is taking place that this is very topical, and media follows that, of course. But also within the participants of all those meetings, I think there's an energy, there's a sense of urgency, and there's a sense of responsibility that really, for all of us now, this is such a crucial issue. We have to do something about it. So I hope my impression is right, but I think yes.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on the good work. That was the president of the meeting of states parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Ambassador Alexander McMahon. Thank you for joining us. We're back live. We're joined by Alison Pitlagh of the Reaching Critical Will program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And you've been following the conference proceedings quite in detail.
Yes.
Throughout the entire conference. So you're the perfect person to speak to and to get a bit of an overview of what's been going down so far. Can you give us an overview?
Yeah, definitely. So the conference opened on Tuesday. There was a high-level opening ceremony in which we heard from a video message from the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the Prime Minister of Fiji and ministers from many other countries worldwide. There were then, I'd say, maybe about 40 or so statements from different states' parties over the course of the day. I think a message that really came through to me was this overwhelming, of course, support for the treaty, but it also was a very nice flow on from Monday's Humanitarian Impacts Conference. There was a lot of language about the impacts of nuclear weapons use and testing, and therefore why the TPNW is so important. And that spilled over into yesterday morning, Wednesday morning, the General Exchange. I think what was a little bit different about yesterday morning's General Exchange is that we did hear from some of the observer states that are here, as well as signatories. A few of the signatories gave updates on their plans to ratify the treaty and where they're at, so that was always really good to hear. I think that the observer states, I think they're here and they're engaging constructively, and we're hearing different things from them. I think they all have slightly different positions on the TPNW and are here maybe for different reasons. So that was interesting to hear as well. But then, after we got out of the General Exchange about halfway through yesterday morning, that's when we got into the other agenda items of the conference. And so the first one that we got into talking about was universalization. And so over the last several months, states parties, together with civil society and other stakeholders, have really been working on the substance of what's going to come out of this meeting of states parties. And that's why I think there are 9 working papers, all on different agenda items. Some of them we heard about yesterday, some more we're going to hear about today. And these working papers contain proposals on a whole range of different topics, on universalization, on the issue of deadlines. We also heard about, of course, the victim assistance and environmental remediation work. And so I think what a lot of the statements yesterday were, laying out what has been heard in the consultations coming up to the MSP, outlining what the recommendations in the working papers are, and then states, indicated how they're feeling about those recommendations. Are they supporting them? Do they have some other ideas? And my understanding is that what they'll do now is they'll take those recommendations and they'll go into the action plan that will hopefully be adopted today.
Wonderful. So basically it's been prepared in working papers, it's been presented in the plenary, and now the presidency is at work in putting together an action plan that then actually commits all states parties to these joint agreements. We have now seen a first draft of the action plan that's going to be discussed and presumably adopted. You've already walked us through a lot of the things that we can expect from that, but are there still some open questions as well?
Yeah, there are still 2 agenda items that are going to come up probably first thing this morning. The one is the discussion about the Scientific Advisory Board that has been proposed, and the other one is about the intersessional work period, how working groups are going to meet, how frequently intersessionals will be held, those kinds of things. I think those are the 2 maybe big outstanding agenda items, and then we'll get into the presentation of the final report, of the action plan, and also of the declaration.
So that's the political declaration that states parties will use as an opportunity to also outline their position on recent developments in the sphere of nuclear weapons, nuclear threats, etc.
Yes, that's exactly right. And my understanding is that I think most of these documents, they've been negotiated now over several weeks, and they're probably in really good shape. There might still be a few wrinkles that are being worked out behind the scenes, but we're optimistic that both will be adopted later today.
Excellent, and we'll be back to discuss those. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me, and maybe just to also offer that for those of you who want more detail on what's being said in the conference room, I'm gonna do a shameless plug for our Nuclear Ban Daily, which is published by WILPF, Reaching Critical Will, and there we've really got into the nitty-gritty of what states are saying in the conference room. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and let me just add that for over a decade, the Reaching Critical Will documents on all of these UN conferences on nuclear weapons have been the go-to resource in order to make sure that you don't miss anything. So, thanks a lot for this wonderful work.
Thank you.
And we're joined now by Tuva Widskjold from an ICAN campaigner in Norway. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And last day of negotiations, all pretty exciting. What have you been up to during the conference? What's the normal day of a campaigner here?
We are here with a group of youth politicians from Norway, and coming from an observer state, or a state that is observing this meeting, we are here to hold our country accountable and to tell the people back home what they are doing, to show that we care, and to make sure that Norway take notice of all the important points that are raised in this meeting. Norway was here also on the humanitarian conference, and we saw that that had a huge impact on our delegation. And now we want to use that to continue to push for Norway to raise the topic of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons.
Norway is really an interesting case because they were also the first state to actually host a humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons conference. So they, in a way, set off this entire process that led to the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Of course, there was a few changes of government in between. Now we've gone full circle. How do you expect this will play in terms of getting Norway closer to the treaty, having them observe yesterday the conference, and how will you use this in order to maybe get them to join as well?
I think we see that other countries have taken over the leadership, but that's a huge inspiration. And seeing the action plan, or the draft of the action plan, it really shows that Norway have to step up if you want to be a progressive country, if you want to take part, if you want to create inclusive meetings. So it's a huge inspiration, and I think it's also an inspiration for Norway. We heard Norway and also other NATO countries yesterday. I think even though we were a bit disappointed they are not like even now already ready to sign the treaty, they still want to engage constructively, and they also have planned to do that in the future. And hopefully these strong statements from a lot of countries that have actually experienced the consequences of nuclear weapons, the civil society that is here, the commitment that we see from the state parties, I think that hits home in Norway and also in the Norwegian delegation, and that they feel that now we really have to step up our game.
Great. So definitely an improvement over time in the positioning of these states from NATO and elsewhere.
Without doubt.
Thank you so much. That concludes our morning segment. We will be back today in the evening, but exceptionally at 6:15 p.m, so a bit later than usual, in order to make sure that we get all the latest info from the conference, because it's scheduled to wrap up, and so we will be a bit later for our last episode this evening. We will be joined by the delegation that is set to take over the work from Austria, so make sure to tune in and see how this conference wraps up, and the summary of the meetings of state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you very much for having been with us, and see you later.